Professor Zelthrani had been teaching history at the Galactic Concord Academy for 214 years. She had seen students from over 40 different species sit in her lecture hall. She had guided young minds through the darkest chapters of galactic civilization and helped them understand why peace was the only logical endpoint for any intelligent species. Nothing surprised her anymore. That was what she believed anyway, on the morning she received the enrollment notice. She was standing in her office on the station world of Valunis Prime, reviewing her course materials for the new semester, when the message appeared on her display screen. It was short and official. A human student had been accepted into her Galactic Conflicts and Resolutions course through the Cultural Exchange Program. His name was Marcus Cole. He was 22 years old. He came from a place called Earth. Zelthrani read the message twice, then set it aside. She was not worried. Humans had joined the galactic community roughly 80 years ago, which made them one of the youngest species in the Concord. They were known for being enthusiastic, a little clumsy, and surprisingly friendly for a species that still ate the flesh of other creatures. Most academics considered them developmentally young. Promising perhaps, but not particularly remarkable. She would treat this Marcus Cole the same way she treated every student, with patience, with care, and with the calm authority of someone who had spent 2 centuries studying the mistakes of civilizations. The first day of the semester arrived, and Zelthrani stood at the front of her lecture hall. The room was built to hold 100 students of various sizes and body types. There were wide platforms for the larger species, liquid-filled pods for the aquatic ones, and standard seats for everyone else. The air was kept at a neutral temperature that made almost nobody comfortable, but kept everyone alive. Her students filed in. She recognized some returning faces. Thesic, a Kavrathi from the warrior caste, took his usual seat near the front. He was tall and insectoid, with 4 arms and a hard shell that clicked when he moved. His species had a long military tradition, and Thesic carried himself with the stiff pride of someone who had trained for combat since birth. He was here to study war from an academic perspective, which his hive mothers considered a waste of time, but allowed anyway. Lien drifted into the room next. She was a delusion, a species made of something like living gelatin. Her body shifted colors depending on her emotional state. Right now, she was a calm blue-green. Delusions were natural empaths. They could feel the emotions of those around them, which made them excellent counselors and terrible poker players. A cluster of small, connected organisms shuffled to a single wide desk near the middle of the room. This was Cadet Brood 67, a Morith hive cluster. They were technically one student, made up of 67 individual units that shared a single consciousness. They smelled faintly of copper and communicated through a harmonic hum that the translation systems in the room converted to standard galactic common. And then there was Marcus. He walked in last. He was average height for a human, which made him shorter than most of the other students. He had brown skin, dark hair cut close to his head, and the kind of face that did not stand out in a crowd. He wore the standard gray uniform of an exchange student. He carried a simple data pad. He looked around the room with wide eyes, taking in the alien shapes and colors and sounds, and then he sat down quietly in an empty seat near the back. Zelthrani watched him settle in. He seemed polite, nervous maybe, but hiding it well. She had read his file. Good grades, no disciplinary issues. A note from his home university described him as diligent and thoughtful. She expected no problems from him. She began her lecture. The topic for the first week was the Typhon suppression, one of the most studied conflicts in Concord history. It had taken place 300 years ago, when the Typhon hegemony attempted to forcibly annex 2 neighboring systems. The resulting war lasted 12 years. 4,000 soldiers and civilians died. It ended when the Concord intervened and negotiated a peace treaty that was still held up as a model of diplomatic resolution. Zelthrani walked her students through the timeline. She showed them the battle maps. She displayed images of the memorial built on Tyvon Prime, a great crystal spire that held the name of every person who died. She let the weight of those 4,000 names settle over the room. The students reacted the way students always reacted. Thesic lowered his head in the warrior's gesture of respect for fallen soldiers. Leon turned a deep shade of violet, which meant sorrow. Cadet Brute 67 hummed a low, mournful chord. The room was heavy with the understanding that war was a terrible thing, that 4,000 lives was a price almost too great to bear. Zelthrani looked to the back of the room, to her new human student. Marcus was writing notes. His face was calm. He was listening carefully, she could tell. He was engaged with the material, but there was something in his expression that she could not quite read. It was not horror. It was not sorrow. It was not even the careful neutrality of someone trying to hide their feelings. It looked, if she had to name it, like patience. The kind of patience a person showed when they were waiting for something bigger to come. She pushed the thought aside. She was reading too much into it. He was a young human, far from home, sitting in a room full of aliens. Of course, he looked a little strange. After class, the students gathered in the corridor outside the lecture hall. Thesic approached Marcus with the blunt directness that was normal for Kavrathi's social interaction. "Human," he said, his mandibles clicking. "What did you think of the lecture?" Marcus looked up at the insectoid towering over him. He seemed to think about the question for a moment longer than was necessary. "It was very informative," he said. Thesic waited for more. Marcus smiled politely, picked up his bag, and walked away down the corridor. Thesic turned to Leon, who had been floating nearby. "Humans are politely boring," he said. Leon did not answer. Her surface had gone pale. Not the pale of sadness or fear, but something else. Something Thesic had never seen on a delusion before. He asked her what was wrong. She watched Marcus disappear around the corner. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He was not bored during the lecture, she said, and he was not sad. Then what was he feeling? Thesic asked. Leon was quiet for a long time. Her colors shifted through shades that had no names in Kavrathi language. "I do not know," she said finally, "but it was very, very large." Thesic clicked his mandibles in confusion and walked away. He did not think about it again. Leon, however, did not sleep well that night. She kept seeing that calm, patient face, and underneath it, something vast and deep and old, like an ocean that had learned to sit still. She did not know the word for it yet. None of them did. But they would. 4 weeks into the semester, Professor Zelthrani reached the part of her course that she always enjoyed the most. It was called Comparative Species Conflict, and it was simple. Each student would stand at the front of the class and present a notable war or conflict from their own species' history. The goal was to build understanding between cultures, to show that every species had darkness in its past, and that every species had found its way through that darkness into the light. It was, in her experience, the module that brought her students closest together. By sharing their pain, they learned empathy. By seeing that others had suffered too, they found common ground. Thesic went first. He stood at the front of the room with all 4 arms clasped behind his back, his posture rigid and formal. He spoke about the Kavrathi brood schism, a civil war that had torn his species apart 6 centuries ago. 22,000 Kavrathi had died, all on a single continent, all fighting over which brood line had the right to lead. He spoke about the battles with the detached respect of a warrior, describing something he both honored and regretted. He showed images of the mass burial sites, the broken hive towers, the fields where the dead had been so numerous that the ground itself changed color. When he finished, the room was silent. Zelthrani thanked him and noted for the class that the Brood Schism remained one of the deadliest conflicts in any single species' history. 22,000 dead was an almost unimaginable toll. Thesic returned to his seat. His shell was dull, which meant he was carrying heavy emotion. Lien reached out a tendril and touched his arm gently, and her surface turned the soft violet of shared grief. Lien went next. Her presentation was not about a war in the traditional sense. Delusians did not fight with weapons. Instead, she spoke about the Great Resonance Collapse, a time when a psychic plague swept through her species and caused a mass emotional breakdown. 800 Delusians died, overwhelmed by feedback loops of despair that their empathic biology could not shut out. She wept as she spoke, her entire body trembling and shifting through dark, painful colors. The class mourned with her. Even Thesic, who was not built for tenderness, bowed his head. Zelthrani guided the class through a moment of quiet reflection. This was how it always went. Pain shared was pain understood. She looked at her roster. The next presenter was Marcus Cole. Marcus walked to the front of the room. He carried his datapad and nothing else. He looked calm. He had dressed neatly. He stood straight, but not stiff. He looked, Zelthrani thought, like a student who had prepared well and was ready to deliver a competent presentation. He began speaking. "I chose a conflict called World War II," he said. His voice was even and steady. "It took place on Earth from 1939 to 1945. I want to be clear that this is not the deadliest conflict in human history. I chose it because it is a good introductory example, and because most humans are familiar with it." Zelthrani noticed the phrase introductory example, but did not interrupt. Marcus tapped his datapad, and a map of Earth appeared on the display wall behind him. He began to explain. There had been multiple sides. Several nations had formed an alliance driven by fascism, racial ideology, and imperial expansion. The rest of the world had fought to stop them. The war was fought on nearly every continent, across every ocean, in the air, and under the sea. Then he began to share the numbers. He said that the total death toll was estimated between 70 and 85 million people. He said this in the same calm, factual tone he had used to introduce the topic. He did not pause for effect. He did not lower his voice. He said the number the way a person might say the temperature outside. Zelthrani felt her crystalline skin crack slightly along her forearms, which was an involuntary stress response she had not experienced in decades. Marcus continued. He talked about something called the Eastern Front, where the fighting between two nations alone killed approximately 30 million people. He explained that one side had deliberately starved entire cities. He showed a map of a place called Stalingrad and described a battle that lasted 5 months inside a single city, fought building by building, room by room, sometimes hand to hand. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians died in that one battle. The room had gone completely still. He moved on to something he called the Holocaust. He explained it simply. One government had decided that certain groups of people were not truly people, and had built an industrial system to murder them. He used that word, industrial. He said they had built factories designed specifically to kill human beings as efficiently as possible. 6 million people from one group alone, millions more from others. He showed no images. He did not need to. The numbers did the work. He talked about the end of the war. He explained that one side had developed a new kind of weapon, a single bomb that could destroy an entire city in a flash of light. They used it twice. He said the first bomb killed approximately 80,000 people instantly, and tens of thousands more died in the weeks that followed from burns and radiation sickness. The second bomb killed around 40,000 instantly. He displayed the names of the cities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. He said the war ended shortly after that. Then he stopped talking and looked at the class. ready for questions. Nobody spoke. Thesic, the warrior who had trained for combat since he was hatched, was gripping the edges of his desk so hard that the surface had cracked beneath his claws. His mandibles were locked shut. His eyes, all 6 of them, were fixed on Marcus with an expression that was not anger and not fear, but something between the two that the Kavrathi language did not have a word for. Lien had collapsed. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a cry. She had simply lost the ability to hold her shape. Her body had spread across her pod, like water poured from a glass, and her colors were cycling rapidly through shades that several students had never seen before. The class medical system had flagged her vital signs. She was not dying, but her empathic biology was in overload. She was not reacting to grief. That was the thing that Zelthrani would later struggle to explain to the academic panel. Lien was not picking up sorrow or trauma from Marcus. She was picking up something far worse. She was picking up calm. Marcus was not horrified by what he had just described. He was not shaking. He was not pale or sweating or fighting back tears. He had absorbed this information years ago, processed it, filed it away, and moved on. He carried the knowledge of 85 million dead the way a person carries the memory of a storm that happened before they were born. It was history. It was, to him, simply the way things had been. And Lien's empathic senses could not make sense of that. Her biology was designed to read emotions, and what she was reading from Marcus was the emotional signature of a species that had stared into an abyss so deep it should have destroyed them, and had instead taken a breath, buried the dead, and built a future anyway. It was not acceptance. It was something larger than acceptance. It was the scar tissue of a species that had learned to function with wounds that would have killed anyone else. Thesic stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. He said nothing. He walked out of the room with the rigid mechanical steps of someone holding themselves together through sheer discipline. 2 of his classmates found him in the corridor 20 minutes later. He was leaning against the wall, shaking. When they asked if he was all right, he said, 22,000. I thought 22,000 was a tragedy. He did not say anything else for a long time. Zelthrani ended the lecture early. She helped the medical team stabilize Lien. She asked Marcus if he was all right, and he said yes, he was fine, and he was sorry if the presentation had been too much. He offered to do a different topic next time. She looked at him, this young, ordinary, polite human, and for the first time in 200 years of teaching, she did not know what to say to a student. That evening, after the last student had left, and the lecture hall was empty and quiet, Professor Zelthrani sat at her desk and composed a message to the Academy administration. She did not explain the situation in detail. She did not attach notes, or files, or recordings. She would do all of that later, when her hands stopped shaking. For now, she wrote only 3 words, and sent them with the highest priority flag the system allowed. The message read, "We have a problem." The Academy asked Marcus Cole to stay home from class for a while. They did not call it a suspension. They called it a temporary academic pause for administrative review. Marcus accepted it without complaint, which somehow made the administration more nervous than if he had argued. Meanwhile, the emergency academic panel met in the High Council chamber on the top level of Velunis Prime. The chamber was large and circular, built from pale stone and lit by floating light spheres. 12 senior faculty members sat around a curved table. Professor Zelthrani sat among them, her crystalline skin still showing faint stress fractures from the day before. The panel chairperson was Dean Oravon, a Palathi with 4 arms, silver fur, and the tired eyes of someone who had managed academic crises for far too long. He opened the meeting by reading aloud the summary of Zelthrani's report. Then he played the recording of Marcus's presentation. Then he played it again, because several members of the panel refused to believe what they had heard. 70 to 85 million, said Dr. Valeth, a Gellian tactical theorist who served as the Academy's military history consultant. He was small, gray-skinned, and usually unshakable. His hands were trembling. In 6 years. That is what the student claimed, said Dean Orovin carefully. We should verify before we proceed. I have already begun verification, said Zelthrani. The student's numbers are consistent with the sources I have found so far. If anything, he was conservative in his estimates. The room was quiet for a moment. Then we verify further, said Orovin. Contact the human embassy. Request access to their full historical records for this conflict. We need to determine whether this was a single unusual event or part of a larger pattern. The response came within 2 hours, which was unusually fast for diplomatic channels. Earth's ambassador to the Concord, Dr. Adieze Okonkwo, arrived in person. She was a tall woman with a warm smile and a firm handshake, and the easy confidence of someone who had spent years explaining humans to confused aliens. She brought the data with her, all of it. She seemed happy to share. World War II is one of our most thoroughly documented conflicts, she told the panel. Marcus chose well. It is a standard topic in our education system. We begin teaching it to children around age 12. Several panel members exchanged looks. Dr. Valeth wrote something on his pad and underlined it twice. You teach this to children? Asked Zelthrani. Of course, said Dr. Okonkwo. We believe it is important for young people to understand the consequences of hatred and the value of standing against tyranny. It is a core part of our moral education. She opened the historical database and offered the panel full access. She suggested they start with World War II, and then explore the broader context at their own pace. Then she sat back and waited. The panel began to read. They read about World War I first because it was listed as a direct cause of World War II. They learned that this earlier war had killed between 15 and 22 million people, and that it had been fought largely over a complex web of alliances, territorial disputes, and national pride. They learned that the weapons used included poison gas, which humans had invented, deployed against each other, been horrified by, and then kept in their stockpiles anyway. They read further back. They found the Napoleonic Wars, the 30 Years' War, which killed roughly 8 million people in Central Europe alone. The Mongol conquests, which some estimates suggested had killed 40 million people across 2 continents over a span of decades. They found the Atlantic slave trade, which was not exactly a war, but involved the forced displacement and death of millions of human beings over several centuries. They read about the 20th century as a whole, and this was where the panel began to truly struggle. Humans had fought 2 world wars, dozens of smaller wars, multiple genocides, and a decades-long standoff between 2 superpowers that came close to destroying all life on their planet. They had invented nuclear weapons, built enough of them to end their own species several times over, pointed them at each other, and then somehow decided not to use them again. Not because they could not, because they chose not to. Dr. Valeth locked himself in his private office for an entire day cycle after accessing the military archives. When he emerged, his silver-gray skin had gone almost white. He submitted a formal recommendation to the panel that humans be immediately reclassified from developmental Tier 3, which meant young species still finding its footing, to strategic threat assessment review urgently, which was a category that had only ever been applied to 2 other species in Concord history, both of which were now extinct. A Moritz psychologist on the panel attempted to build a mathematical model that could explain how a species could endure this level of cyclical violence and still remain psychologically stable enough to cooperate, build cities, raise children, and eventually reach the stars. The model failed. She adjusted the parameters and ran it again. She told the panel that according to every psychological framework the Concord had developed over 600 years of multi-species research, humans should have either destroyed themselves completely or collapsed into permanent traumatized paralysis long before they invented electricity. And yet, she said, they are here, they are functional, they are, by all accounts, quite friendly. The panel sat with this for a while. Then Zelthrani raised a point that she had been thinking about since the day of Marcus's presentation. It was not just that humans survived their wars, it was what they did afterward. She had been reading human cultural records alongside the military ones, and what she found there disturbed her in ways that the death tolls had not. Humans wrote poetry about their wars, they composed music, they painted pictures and made films and told stories. They built enormous memorials to their dead, and then brought their children to visit those memorials and stand in silence and try to feel what had been lost. They took the worst things that had ever happened to them and turned them into art, and then they used that art to teach the next generation, and then the next generation grew up and sometimes fought wars of their own, and then they wrote more poetry. It was a cycle, but it was not a mindless one. Each time they carried the memory forward. Each time they tried to do better. They did not always succeed, but they always tried. And the trying was the part that Zelthrani could not fit into any model of species behavior she had ever studied. Every other species in the Concord had achieved peace by becoming gentle. They had evolved past their violent impulses, or suppressed them, or redirected them into ritual. They had simply decided, over and over again, that the world they wanted was worth bleeding for, and then they had bled for it, and then they had gotten up the next morning and gone to work. The panel discussed what to do for 3 more days. There were arguments, there were long silences, there were moments when someone would read a new piece of human history, and the entire room would need a break. Near the end, Dr. Okonkwo was called back for a follow-up meeting. She answered their questions with patience and good humor. As she was leaving, she paused at the door and turned back. "I should mention," she said, "I spoke with Marcus. He feels terrible about upsetting his classmates. He asked me to tell you he is happy to choose a lighter topic next time. Perhaps something like the Falklands War." "How many died in this Falklands War?" asked Dean Orovin. 907, said Dr. Okonkwo. Okonwo. The panel visibly relaxed. "That might work," said Orovin. Dr. Okonwo hesitated. "Although," she said, "you might not want him to mention that we fought it over a small group of islands that most humans could not find on a map." The panel stared at her. 907 people, said Zelthrani slowly, over islands that your own species could not locate. Dr. Okonwo shrugged in the way that humans did when they knew something was absurd, but had made peace with it long ago. "We are a complicated species," she said, and then she left. Dean Orovin looked around the table at his colleagues. Nobody spoke. The floating lights hummed softly overhead. "We need a new policy," he said. Nobody disagreed. The Academy's solution arrived 2 weeks later in the form of Dr. Suvik, a Palathi xenopsychologist with 4 arms, soft gray fur, and a professional smile that he had spent years perfecting. He specialized in cross-species trauma response. He had worked with survivors of the Morith colony collapse, counseled Kavrathi soldiers through post-combat stress, and once spent 6 months helping a Delusian community recover from an empathic feedback crisis. He was, by every measure, one of the most qualified therapists in the Concord. He had also read the briefing file on human history, and he had not slept well since. His assignment was simple in theory. The Academy had created a new position called Monitored War Counselor. Dr. Suvik would sit in on every history class that included a human student. His job was not to counsel the human. His job was to counsel everyone else. He arrived at the academy on a quiet morning and spent his first hour reviewing the classroom layout, the student roster, and the emergency medical protocols. Then he sat in Zelthrani's empty lecture hall and read through Marcus Cole's file one more time. Good grades, polite, cooperative, no history of violence or psychological instability. A perfectly normal young man from a perfectly normal human family. Dr. Suvik set the file down and rubbed his face with two of his 4 hands. In his 40 years of practice, he had never been assigned to monitor someone because they were too well-adjusted. Marcus returned to class the following day. He walked in with his bag over his shoulder and his data pad under his arm, and he paused when he saw Dr. Suvik sitting in a chair near the side of the room. "Who is that?" Marcus whispered to Thesic, who was already in his seat. Thesic looked at Dr. Suvik, then back at Marcus. "He is here for you," Thesic said. "For me? Like a therapist?" "More like a translator," said Thesic. Then he paused and added, "For the rest of us." Marcus looked confused but sat down without arguing. He nodded politely at Dr. Suvik, who nodded politely back. The other students treated Marcus differently now, not with hostility. Nobody was angry at him. But there was a new distance in some of them, and a new closeness in others. The Morath hive cluster had rearranged themselves so that their sensory units faced Marcus at all times, as if they wanted to watch him more carefully. 2 Valerie students who had previously sat near him had moved to the far side of the room. Thesic, however, had moved closer. He sat in the seat directly next to Marcus now, his massive insectoid frame towering over the human. When Marcus asked why, Thesic said, "A warrior should sit near the most dangerous person in the room. It is respectful." Marcus laughed, because he thought Thesic was joking. Thesic was not joking. Zelthrani began the lecture with a new protocol in place. Any topic that touched on human history was now flagged in advance. Dr. Suvik would prepare the class with what he called emotional inoculation exercises, which were essentially guided breathing and mental grounding techniques designed to prevent the kind of empathic overload that had hit Lian weeks earlier. Lian herself had recovered, though she was quieter now. She sat in her pod and kept her colors muted. She participated in discussions, but avoided looking directly at Marcus for long periods. When asked about this, she said it was not that Marcus frightened her. It was that what she sensed inside him was so large and so deep that looking at it for too long was like staring into a sun. Not harmful in small doses, but overwhelming in its fullness. The weeks passed. The class continued. Marcus participated like any other student. He asked thoughtful questions. He wrote solid papers. He was respectful of his classmates' histories and genuinely interested in learning about their cultures. In every way that mattered, he was an excellent student. But every now and then, something would happen that reminded everyone in the room that Marcus came from somewhere very different. During a lecture on the Pelathai resource negotiations, a conflict that lasted 2 years and ended with 0 casualties thanks to early diplomatic intervention, Zelthrani asked Marcus for his thoughts. He said it was an impressive example of conflict resolution. Then, without thinking, he added, "It is interesting that they managed to avoid any fighting at all. That must have taken incredible restraint." The room went quiet. To every other student in the class, avoiding fighting was not restraint. It was the obvious and natural outcome. The idea that not killing each other required special effort was something they had never considered. Dr. Suvik made a note on his pad. Another time, during a discussion about the ethics of preemptive military action, Marcus casually mentioned that humans had an entire field of academic study called just war theory, which was a philosophical framework for determining when it was morally acceptable to go to war. He said it as if this were a perfectly normal thing, the way someone might mention that their species had a branch of mathematics or a type of cooking. Thesic asked how many categories of just war humans had identified. Marcus listed several: self-defense, defense of others, prevention of genocide, resistance against tyranny, protection of fundamental rights. He spoke about each one, clearly and without emotion, like a student reciting a textbook. Cadet Brood 67 emitted a harmonic that the translation system rendered as, "You have a formal system for deciding when killing is acceptable." "Several, actually," said Marcus. "Different philosophers came up with different frameworks. We have been debating it for about 2,000 years. Dr. Suvik made another note, then he underlined it. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy lecture, Dr. Suvik asked Marcus to stay behind for a brief conversation. Zelthrani remained as well, grading papers at her desk, but clearly listening. "Marcus," said Dr. Suvik carefully, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. How do you feel about the material we have been covering?" Marcus thought about it. "I think it is fascinating," he said. "Every species has such different experiences with conflict. It really puts things in perspective. And when you presented your own species' history, World War II, how did that feel?" "Fine," said Marcus. "I mean, it is terrible, obviously, all of it. But it is history. It happened. We learned from it. Or we tried to, anyway." Dr. Suvik leaned forward. "That is what I find remarkable, Marcus. You say it is terrible, and I believe you mean it. But you also say it is just history. You have integrated this knowledge completely. It doesn't destabilize you." "Should it?" Marcus asked, and the question was genuine. "For most species," said Dr. Suvik, "knowledge of violence on that scale would be permanently destabilizing. It would reshape the entire psychological framework of the individual. The fact that it does not do this to you is not a flaw, Marcus, but I want you to understand something. The counselor position was not created to protect you. It was created to protect everyone else. Because what you consider normal is, by the standards of every other species in this academy, extraordinary." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry. I did not mean to upset anyone." "I know," said Dr. Suvik. "That is, in some ways, the most remarkable part." Marcus left. Zelthrani looked up from her papers. "Ask him," she said. "Ask him the real question." Dr. Suvik caught Marcus in the corridor. "One more thing," he said. "I am curious. Why do humans keep fighting? You have seen what it costs. You know the numbers. You carry the dead with you. Why do you keep going to war?" Marcus stopped walking. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at Dr. Suvik. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not louder or softer, but somehow more honest. "Because we keep finding things worth fighting for," he said. "Freedom, justice, each other. We look at the world and we see what is wrong, and something in us refuses to accept it. Even when the cost is terrible, even when we know we might not win, we fight because we believe tomorrow can be better than today, and we are willing to bleed to prove it." He paused. "I know that probably sounds crazy." "It sounds," said Dr. Suvik quietly, "like something I will be thinking about for a very long time." That evening, from across the corridor, Lien had been listening. She did not seize. She did not collapse. Instead, her surface shifted to a color that no one in the academy had ever seen on a Delusian before. When a passing student asked what the color meant, she was quiet for a moment. "It is the color for something that is terrifying," she said, "and also beautiful. We do not use it often." Dr. Suvik went home that night and wrote his first weekly report. It was 40 pages long. He detailed every observation, every interaction, every moment that had confirmed what he already suspected. The summary at the bottom of the report was a single sentence: "The human is well adjusted. This is the problem." The academic year ended on Volunus Prime the way it always did, with the soft glow of the station's artificial sunset cycling through shades of gold and violet, and the hallways of the Galactic Concord Academy filling with the sounds of students preparing to return home. But this year, before the ceremonies and the farewells, the Academy's governing board met one final time to address the matter that had quietly consumed their attention for months. The boardroom was the same pale stone chamber where the emergency panel had first convened. Dean Oravan sat at the head of the table, looking older than he had at the start of the year. Around him sat department heads, senior professors, 2 military advisors, and a xenopsychology team that had been brought in from an off-world institute specifically to review Dr. Suvik's reports. Those reports had become something of a sensation in academic circles. Suvik had written one every week for the entire semester. Each was detailed, thoughtful, and deeply unsettling. Together they painted a portrait of a species that every psychological model said should not exist, and yet not only existed, but thrived. 3 other species had formally requested access to Earth's historical archives after reading summaries of the reports. 2 of those requests were academic. The third came from Dr. Valith, the Gellian military theorist, who had filed his request under the category of strategic necessity and had been unusually quiet in faculty meetings ever since. Zelthrani was the first to address the board. She stood at the front of the room with her hands folded, her crystalline skin smooth and steady. Whatever stress fractures she had suffered earlier in the year had healed. But she was not the same professor who had opened the semester with calm confidence and 2 centuries of certainty about how the galaxy worked. "I have been teaching for 214 years, she began. "In that time, I believed I understood the relationship between civilization and violence. I believed that every species followed the same path. They began in conflict, they suffered, they learned, and eventually they chose peace, because they understood that peace was the only sustainable option. Violence was a phase, a developmental stage, something to be grown out of." She paused. "I was wrong," she said. "Not about most species. For most species that model holds true. But humans do not fit the model. Humans have not grown out of violence. They have not suppressed it, or ritualized it, or evolved past it. They have done something that I did not think was possible. They have learned to carry it." She looked around the room. Every face was turned toward her. "Humans carry their violence the way a river carries stones," she said. "It is always there. It shapes them, it wears them down, and builds them up at the same time. They do not pretend it doesn't exist. They build monuments to it. They teach it to their children. They write songs about it. And then they get up the next morning and choose, once again, to build something instead of destroying it. Not because they cannot destroy, but because they have decided, over and over, that creation is worth more." She took a breath. Every species in the Concord achieved peace by becoming gentle. Humans achieved interstellar travel while still being dangerous. They did not conquer their violence. They learned to aim it. And that makes them either the greatest threat this galaxy has ever faced, or the greatest ally we could ever hope for. I am no longer certain that we get to choose which one. The room was silent when she finished. Dean Oravan let the silence hold for a long moment before he spoke. "What is your recommendation, Professor?" "Do not ban humans from history courses," she said firmly. "Their perspective is too valuable. They see things we cannot see. They understand conflict from the inside in a way that no other species can, because they have lived inside it for their entire existence, and they are still here. But the counselor protocol must be permanent. Every human student, in every history or conflict studies course, at every academy in the Concord, must have a trained war counselor present. Not for the human's sake, for everyone else's." The board discussed it for 2 hours. There were concerns. There were objections. One board member argued that the Counselor Protocol implied humans were dangerous, which could damage diplomatic relations. Zelthrani replied that humans were dangerous, and that pretending otherwise would be a disservice to both species. Another board member asked whether the policy was discriminatory. Dr. Suvik, who had been invited to observe, spoke up for the first time. "It is not discrimination," he said. "It is accommodation. We do not ask Dolucians to suppress their empathic abilities in class. We provide them with shielded pods. We do not ask Kavrathi to hide their natural weapons. We give them reinforced desks. This is the same principle. Humans carry something inside them that other species are not equipped to encounter unprepared. The Counselor is not a guard. The Counselor is a bridge." The vote was held. It passed unanimously. The policy was given a formal name, the Cole Protocol, after the student whose presentation had started everything. When Marcus was informed of this, he turned red in the face, which the other students had learned was a human stress response, and said he would really prefer they name it something else. The board declined. The graduation ceremony took place 3 days later, under the artificial sky of the Academy's central atrium. Students from dozens of species gathered in their formal attire. The Kavrathi wore polished ceremonial armor. The Dolucians floated in spheres of treated water. The Morith clusters hummed in harmonized chords. Marcus wore his gray exchange uniform, cleaned and pressed, with a small Earth flag pinned to his collar. The ceremony itself was brief by galactic standards. Dean Oravan gave a speech about growth and understanding, and the importance of learning from those who were different. He did not mention humans specifically, but several faculty members noticed that he looked in Marcus's direction more than once. Afterward, the students gathered in the courtyard to say goodbye. Marcus made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging contact information, and promising to stay in touch. He was smiling, and his smile was the simple, honest kind that made it clear he had no idea how much he had changed the people around him. Thesic found him near the fountain. The Kavrathi warrior stood at his full height, all 4 arms at his sides, his shell polished to a bright shine. He looked down at Marcus for a long moment. "Human," he said. "Thesic," said Marcus. Thesic extended one of his upper arms. Marcus took it, and Thesic clasped his forearm in the Kavrathi warrior's bond. It was a gesture of deep respect, a recognition of shared strength between two fighters. It had never, in the entire history of the Kavrathi species, been offered to a non-Kavrathi. "You are small," said Thesic, "and you will die long before I do. But I will tell my brood children about you." Marcus did not know what to say to that, so he just squeezed Thesic's arm and nodded. Lian approached next. She moved slowly, her colors shifting through soft, warm shades. She extended a single tendril and wrapped it gently around Marcus's hand. Her surface bloomed into that color again, the one that no one had a name for. The one she had said meant something terrifying and also beautiful. "I will not forget what you carry," she said, "and I will not forget that you carry it gently." Cadet Brood 67 was last. The cluster surrounded Marcus briefly, all 67 units humming in unison. The translation system processed the sound and rendered it in Galactic Common. "You are small and temporary," they said, "and we will remember you." Marcus boarded his shuttle an hour later. He waved from the boarding ramp, just a young man going home after a year abroad. And then the door closed and the shuttle lifted and disappeared into the black. Dr. Suvik stood beside Zelthrani on the observation deck and watched the ship shrink to a point of light and then to nothing. "He has no idea, does he," said Dr. Suvik, "what he represents?" Zelthrani was quiet for a long time. The station's artificial sunset was fading to deep blue. The stars beyond the viewport were steady and cold and impossibly far apart. "No," she said. and that may be the most human thing about him. They stood there for a while longer, two aliens looking at the place where a human had been, and then they turned and walked back inside. 3 years later, on a different academy, on a different station, in a different arm of the galaxy, a young human woman sat down in her first history class. She was nervous and excited and a little overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. She unpacked her datapad and looked around the room and noticed a Pelathi sitting quietly in a chair near the wall. He had 4 arms and gray fur and a gentle, professional smile. She leaned over to the student next to her, a small feathered creature with bright eyes. "Who is that?" she whispered. "He is the War Counselor," said the feathered creature. "War Counselor, what is that for?" His smile widened just a little, and there was something in his eyes that was equal parts warmth and wariness. "You will see," he said. The professor locked in, the lights dimmed, the lecture began. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between stars, the galaxy held its breath, the way it always did when humans started talking about the past.